James Whitaker met Margaret at a charity gala in downtown Chicago. She was the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. Her laughter cut through the hum of conversation, drawing attention like a spotlight. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. Men leaned closer when she spoke, captivated by her wit and charm. James was no exception. As an architect, he prided himself on his measured demeanor, his ability to remain composed. But Margaret unraveled him with a single glance. "You're staring?" she teased, her red lips curling into a playful smile. James blinked, caught off guard. "Am I? Perhaps it's because you light up the room." Margaret tilted her head, intrigued. "Flattery suits you, mister." "Whitaker," he supplied, offering his hand. "James Whitaker." From that moment, their connection was electric. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, and by the end of the evening, Margaret had agreed to dinner the following week. Their romance was a whirlwind. Margaret had a way of making every moment feel larger than life. On their third date, she dragged James to a jazz club, pulling him onto the dance floor despite his protests. "I don't dance," he said, laughing nervously. "You do tonight," she replied, her eyes sparkling. James found himself swept up in her energy, her zest for life. She made him feel alive in ways he hadn't realized he was missing. By their 6th month together, he proposed, unable to imagine a future without her. Their wedding was small but joyous, held in the garden of the home James had designed for them. Margaret insisted on lilacs and white roses, filling the air with their fragrance. "You built this for us," she whispered that night, running her fingers along the polished wood of their bedroom door. "It feels like a fairy tale." "And you're the happily ever after," James replied, pulling her close. The first 2 years of their marriage were filled with passion and laughter. Margaret turned their house into a lively home, hosting dinner parties and planning weekend getaways. James adored her spontaneity, the way she danced barefoot in the kitchen or sang off-key while folding laundry. Their physical connection was equally intense. Margaret had a way of igniting a fire in James, making him forget the world outside their bedroom. Their nights were filled with whispered promises and tangled sheets, a love that felt unbreakable. But even in their bliss, there were cracks James chose to ignore. Margaret's need for excitement sometimes bordered on recklessness. She thrived on attention, basking in the admiration of others at their social gatherings. James occasionally felt a pang of jealousy when he noticed how men lingered too long in conversation with her, their eyes wandering. But Margaret always brushed off his concerns with a laugh. "Oh, James," she'd say, placing a hand on his chest, "you're the only one I want, you know that." And for a while he believed her. By their 3rd year of marriage, James began to sense a shift in Margaret. She became restless, often complaining about the monotony of suburban life. "Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating," she admitted one night, staring out the window. James frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I just miss the excitement, the way things used to be." James tried to rekindle their spark, planning romantic dinners and surprising her with weekend trips, but Margaret's restlessness only grew. She started staying out late, claiming she needed time to herself. One evening, James found himself alone at one of their dinner parties. Margaret had disappeared into the study with a male guest, her laughter spilling into the hallway. When she returned, her lipstick was smudged, her hair slightly tousled. "What were you doing?" James asked, his voice tight. "Talking," she replied breezily, brushing past him. The seed of doubt was planted. James's suspicions were confirmed a few months later when he found the letter in Margaret's coat pocket. The words were intimate, the tone unmistakably romantic. When Margaret came home that evening, he confronted her, the letter trembling in his hands. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with anger. Margaret froze, her eyes darting to the incriminating evidence. "James, I can explain." "Explain what?" he snapped. "That you've been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back?" Her silence spoke volumes. Their argument that night was explosive. Margaret admitted to the affair but insisted it wasn't serious. "Doesn't mean anything," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It was a mistake. I needed something different." "Different?" James repeated, his voice breaking. "I built my life around you, Margaret. I gave you everything." Margaret reached for him, but he pulled away. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." But her apology wasn't enough to repair the damage. Margaret left the next morning, leaving James alone in the house they had built together. 2 years passed before James allowed himself to entertain the idea of love again. He met Evelyn at a library, their hands brushing as they reached for the same book. Evelyn was everything Margaret was not: calm, grounded, and content with life's simple pleasures. Their courtship was slow, filled with quiet moments and thoughtful gestures. Evelyn didn't demand excitement or grandeur. She appreciated James for who he was. They married in a small ceremony, surrounded by close friends. James felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "She's nothing like Margaret," he told himself. "This time it will last." For the first decade of their marriage, Evelyn brought stability to James's life. She turned their house into a haven, filling it with warmth and light. Their evenings were spent reading by the fire or tending the garden, a far cry from the chaos of James's first marriage. But beneath the surface, James carried a lingering fear. He couldn't shake the memory of Margaret's betrayal, the way it had blindsided him. Sometimes, he caught himself scrutinizing Evelyn's actions, searching for signs of deceit where there were none. "Do you trust me?" Evelyn asked one night, sensing his unease. "Of course," James replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The life James shared with Evelyn began as a sanctuary, a reprieve from the chaos and heartbreak of his first marriage. Evelyn was the quiet rhythm to his days, a source of comfort and steadiness that made him feel for the first time in years that he was building something unshakable. Their mornings were marked by rituals of affection: coffee brewing as the sun poured through the kitchen windows, Evelyn humming softly as she watered the garden. In the evenings, they would read by the fire, their knees touching beneath the blanket they shared. Evelyn's hand would often rest on James's, her thumb brushing his skin in gentle circles. "You're so good to me," Evelyn would say, her voice tinged with gratitude. James often thought he didn't deserve her. After Margaret's betrayal, he had become guarded. The walls he built in his architecture reflected in the emotional barriers he erected around himself. But Evelyn was patient, never pushing him to share more than he was ready to. For a decade, their marriage was a picture of tranquility, but James's scars never fully healed. Even in their happiest moments, he carried the weight of his past, a gnawing fear that history could repeat itself. The first shift in Evelyn's behavior was so small that James almost didn't notice it. She began coming home later, her explanations vague but plausible. "Sorry, love," she said one evening, setting her purse on the counter. "The school board meeting ran over again." James accepted her excuse without question, telling himself that Evelyn was simply dedicated to her work. But as the late nights grew more frequent, he couldn't ignore the growing unease in his chest. "Do they always schedule meetings this late?" he asked one night, trying to keep his tone casual. Evelyn shrugged. "It's just a busy time of year, curriculum changes, budget discussions. It's nothing unusual." James nodded, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the weeks that followed, he noticed other changes. Evelyn seemed distracted, her laughter less frequent, her touch more distant. On weekends, she began excusing herself for errands that stretched into hours, returning with vague stories about traffic or long lines at the store. James tried to rationalize his suspicions, telling himself he was being paranoid. "She's not Margaret," he reminded himself. "She wouldn't do that to me." But the memories of his first wife's betrayal haunted him, the wounds reopening with every late night and unexplained absence. The discovery that unraveled their marriage came on a rainy Thursday evening. Evelyn had left her coat draped over the back of the sofa, and as James moved to hang it in the closet, a slip of paper fell from the pocket. It was a hotel receipt dated 2 nights earlier. For a moment, James stood frozen, the receipt trembling in his hands. His mind raced with questions, each one more devastating than the last. Was it a work booking, a dinner meeting with colleagues, or was it something worse? By the time Evelyn returned home that night, James was seated at the kitchen table, the receipt laid out in front of him like evidence in a courtroom. Evelyn paused in the doorway, her smile fading as she saw his expression. "James? What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" he echoed, his voice calm but edged with restrained fury. He gestured to the receipt. "This is what's wrong." Evelyn's eyes widened, her face paling. "James, I can explain." "Explain what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "Explain why my wife is booking hotel rooms in the middle of the week? Explain why you've been sneaking around and lying to me?" Evelyn's lips trembled as tears filled her eyes. "It's not what you think," she began, but James slammed his hand on the table, cutting her off. "Then tell me what it is," he shouted, his chest heaving with anger. For a moment, Evelyn said nothing. Then her shoulders sagged, and she sank into the chair opposite him. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was one night, James. It didn't mean anything." James's heart shattered at her words, the betrayal cutting deeper than he thought possible. "Who?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Who was it?" "A colleague," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. "It's over, James. I swear it's over. Please, just let me fix this." "Fix this?" James repeated, his laugh bitter and hollow. "You think you can fix this with apologies and promises? You've destroyed everything, Evelyn. Everything." The argument that followed was explosive, years of suppressed fears and resentments erupting like a dam breaking under pressure. Evelyn accused James of being distant, of shutting her out emotionally. "You don't let me in," she cried, her voice breaking. "I've tried, James, but it's like you're always waiting for me to fail. I felt so alone." "Don't you dare blame this on me," James roared, his fists clenched. "I loved you, I trusted you, and you threw it all away." Evelyn sobbed, reaching for him, but he pulled away. "I can't do this," he said, his voice cold and final. "You've made your choice, now I'm making mine." The next morning, James packed a bag and left, leaving Evelyn alone in the house that had once been their sanctuary. James's pain quickly turned to anger, and that anger demanded an outlet. He tracked down Evelyn's colleague, the man who had been her lover, and sent him an anonymous letter. "You may think you've won, but all you've inherited is a liar and a cheat. Good luck." It was petty, but it gave James a fleeting sense of satisfaction. He also packed Evelyn's belongings into boxes and had them delivered to her colleague's address. Each box was carefully labeled with reminders of her betrayal, framed photographs from their wedding, letters she had once written to James, even her favorite book with a note tucked inside. For someone who clearly forgot what love is, the revenge was calculated, but it did little to ease the ache in James's chest. The betrayal of 2 wives left James feeling hollow, as though the foundations of his life had been reduced to rubble. Unable to bear the memories that haunted his home, he sold the house and retreated to the wilderness, determined to escape the pain of human connection. For years, James lived alone in a cabin he built with his own hands, his days filled with the steady rhythm of survival, chopping wood, fishing, tending to a small garden. The solitude was a balm for his wounds, though the nights were long and lonely. The decision to leave everything behind came suddenly but felt inevitable. After Evelyn's betrayal, James found himself unable to stay in the city. Everywhere he turned, there were reminders of what he had lost: the house he had once built as a testament to love, the streets where he and Evelyn had walked hand in hand, and the lingering ghosts of Margaret's laughter. He sold the house without a second thought, leaving the furniture and trinkets behind, as if shedding a skin. With the money, he bought a plot of land deep in the forests of northern Wisconsin, miles away from the nearest town. There, surrounded by towering pines and the serene stillness of nature, he planned to rebuild not a life, but a refuge. The journey to the wilderness was long and silent. James drove alone, the back of his truck loaded with only the essentials: tools, canned food, and a single photo album he couldn't bring himself to leave behind. The forest greeted him with a kind of quiet he hadn't known in years. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. It felt unspoiled, untouched by the chaos and pain of the world he was leaving behind. This is where it ends, James thought as he stepped out of the truck, surveying the land, and where it begins. The first weeks in the forest were grueling. James threw himself into the task of building a cabin, his body aching from the labor, but his mind finally quiet. Each swing of the hammer, each log he placed, felt like a step toward reclaiming control over his life. He worked from dawn until dusk, pausing only to eat or drink from the nearby stream. At night, he sat by the fire, his muscles sore but his heart strangely light. The cabin took shape slowly, its walls rising from the ground like a sanctuary. James found satisfaction in the simplicity of his days. There were no late-night arguments, no suspicious glances, no aching betrayals, just the sound of the forest, the rhythm of his own breathing, and the steady progress of his hands. As the weeks turned into months, the cabin became more than a structure. It became his fortress, a barrier between himself and the world that had twice betrayed him. Though the wilderness provided James with physical solitude, his mind often drifted back to the life he had left behind. The evenings were the hardest. As he sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, memories of Margaret and Evelyn would surface, unbidden and sharp. He remembered the way Margaret used to laugh, her head thrown back, her hair catching the light. He remembered the first time he had kissed Evelyn, the quiet intensity of her gaze as she whispered his name. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by their betrayals. Margaret's laughter, once a source of joy, now felt mocking. Evelyn's whispered promises felt hollow, their intimacy reduced to lies. Was it me? James wondered aloud one night, his voice breaking the stillness of the cabin. Was I not enough? The forest, indifferent to his pain, offered no answer. Months after settling in the cabin, James made a trip to the nearest town for supplies. At the post office, the clerk handed him a bundle of letters, their addresses written in familiar handwriting. Evelyn. James stared at the stack, his chest tightening. He hadn't expected her to write, hadn't imagined she would even know where to find him. He took the letters back to the cabin but left them unopened on the small wooden table by his bed. Days turned into weeks, and still, the letters remained unread, their presence both a temptation and a reminder of wounds he was trying to forget. One evening, unable to resist any longer, James opened the first letter. James, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know how deeply I regret what I've done. I betrayed you, and in doing so, I betrayed myself. I think of you every day, and I hope that one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me. The words blurred as James's eyes filled with tears. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, unable to bring himself to read the rest. The unexpected knock on the cabin door came one autumn evening. James had been chopping wood when he heard the sound, startling him. Visitors were rare, nearly unheard of in his remote location. When he opened the door, he froze. Evelyn stood there, her coat damp from the rain, her face pale and tired. "James?" she said, softly, her voice trembling. "I had to see you." He stepped aside reluctantly, allowing her into the cabin. The warmth of the fire contrasted with the tension between them, as Evelyn sat in the single chair by the hearth. "Are you here?" James asked, his tone wary. "I needed to apologize," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Not in a letter, not from a distance. I needed to say it to your face." James folded his arms, leaning against the wall. "And what do you think an apology will fix, Evelyn? Do you think it'll undo the lies? The betrayal?" Evelyn flinched, but didn't look away. "I don't expect it to fix anything. I just needed you to know that I regret everything. I was weak, James, and I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. For a moment, James felt the urge to comfort her, to reach out and tell her it was okay. But it wasn't. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice steady, "I've forgiven you. Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying that anger, it was killing me. But forgiveness doesn't mean I want you back. It doesn't mean I can forgive." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, but she nodded. "I understand." She left the cabin that night, disappearing into the rain. James stood in the doorway, watching her go, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and relief. After Evelyn's visit, James felt a shift within himself. The pain of his past still lingered, but it no longer consumed him. He began to find solace in the simplicity of his life, the steady rhythm of the wilderness. He spent his days tending to his garden, fishing in the nearby stream, and chopping wood for the fire. The forest became his companion, its silence offering a kind of healing he hadn't found in the noise of the city. James knew he would never love again, but he didn't need to. The love he sought was no longer from others. It was the peace he had finally found within himself. Years passed, and James Whitaker became one with the forest that had sheltered him. His cabin, nestled deep within the towering pines of northern Wisconsin, stood as a testament to his resilience, a structure he built with his own hands after the rubble of 2 failed marriages. The life he led in solitude was far from what he had envisioned as a younger man, but it was one he had learned to embrace. James grew older in the quiet rhythm of the wilderness. The lines on his face deepened with time, not just from age, but from the wisdom that came with heartbreak and healing. His days were simple but purposeful, tending to the garden that provided his sustenance, fishing in the icy stream nearby, chopping wood to warm his modest home. Each task was a meditation, a step further away from the chaos of the life he had left behind. At night, the cabin was illuminated by the soft glow of a fire. James often sat in his worn armchair, a journal open on his lap. He wrote sparingly, reflections on the seasons, fragments of memories, and the occasional lingering thought of Margaret or Evelyn. But the words were no longer bitter. Instead, they carried a quiet acceptance, as if James had finally made peace with the ghosts that had haunted him. On the small wooden table beside his bed was a box, carefully crafted from oak. Inside were the relics of his past, photographs of Margaret laughing in the garden of their first home, letters from Evelyn written after their separation, and a few keepsakes from his life before the wilderness. One of the letters, written in James's steady hand, was addressed simply to whoever finds this. If you are reading this, then my journey has come to an end. I was once a man who believed in permanence. I thought love, like the homes I built, could weather any storm. But life taught me that even the strongest foundations can crack, and the people we trust most can betray us. Margaret was my first love, and she broke my heart. Evelyn was my second chance, and she did the same. For years I carried the weight of their betrayals, believing it was my burden alone to bear. I became angry, bitter, and lost. But the forest saved me. Here, I learned that life is not about avoiding pain, but embracing it, letting it shape you without letting it define you. The trees don't fear the wind, they bend, and when the storm passes, they stand taller. I have forgiven Margaret and Evelyn, not because they asked for it, but because holding on to anger only hurt me. I hope they found their own peace as I found mine here. The letter ended with a simple line: "Do not mourn me. I lived, I loved, I hurt, and I healed, and that is enough." After James's death, his cabin became a place of quiet reverence for those who stumbled upon it. A wandering hiker who discovered the cabin and the letter shared James's story with the local community. Word spread, and people began to see the cabin not as a lonely man's retreat, but as a monument to resilience and the human spirit's capacity to endure. The land was left undisturbed, the cabin preserved as James had left it. Inside, the journals he kept were discovered, filled with reflections on nature, life, and love. "There is beauty in solitude," one entry read, "not because it is free of pain, but because it strips life down to its essence. In the quiet, you face yourself, and you learn what you're made of." James's life was not the one he had dreamed of as a young architect, sketching designs for homes filled with love and laughter. But in the stillness of the forest, he found something deeper: the strength to rebuild himself after being shattered, the wisdom to forgive without forgetting, and the courage to live without bitterness. Though he died alone, James did not die lonely. The forest was his companion, the stars his witnesses, and the quiet his solace. As the seasons changed, the trees around his cabin continued to grow, their roots sinking deep into the earth, a fitting tribute to the man who had finally found his own unshakable foundation.